This is Dr. Carroll, and this is another video in the exception handling series. Programmers need to expect the unexpected to occur. There are two general ways to accomplish this: error checking and exception handling. This video is going to contrast the two and to shed better light on what's going on. So let's start with an error checking example. The example we're going to do is to calculate the average score input from the user, from multiple inputs from the user. And so we're going to have a main function, and so we need to call the main function. And we want to continue asking for scores and while they want to keep going. And so while the response is yes, then let's keep going. So let's make sure we set that at the bottom of the loop, ask them if they want to keep calculating more averages. Do you have more scores to average, yes or no? And then let's make it lower so that we can make that continuation criterion in the while loop that much simpler. Okay, and then we're going to ask the user how many scores do they have to enter. And we're going to prompt them and then immediately pass that to int to get the number of inputs. And so then let's put all these inputs in one list just to make it easier, and let's start our counter. And so we're going to keep a flag of if there's errors. So the no errors is a Boolean type, and I call it a flag because we're setting it to true or false. And so we say while the counter is less than the number of inputs plus 1, so let's start with 1 and then go up to that amount. Then, and there are no errors, then keep counting. Okay, so that'll be at the bottom of our loop. And so what errors could occur? Well, we'll see some as they come up. So let's retrieve the specified number of scores from the user one at a time. So let's prompt them to please enter a score and asking them for score number 1, score number 2, score number 3, and so on. And then we need to verify that it's valid. So we need to test all the characters to make sure that they're either a digit or a period, and that there's at most one period. And so, and just as a disclaimer, this isn't complete for testing all valid floats. And also, let's allow for a positive or negative sign on the left side, okay? And so what we got from the user, remember, input returns a string type, so we've stored that in score string. And then, so is it a float? We'll say yes, unless we find out otherwise. And then how many periods did we have? Well, we have 0 to start out with. So let's go through each character and do that with a for loop, and then for each character in score string, assign that to char. Now, then we need to test, well, it's either a digit or it's a period. And so if it's not a digit and it's not a period, then it's not a float. But if it is a period, then if we've seen more than one period, then it's not a float. Otherwise, we just say, hey, we found the period. So if it is a float, then now we can confidently cast it as a float, and then we can add that to our scores list. But if it's not, then we say, hey, I found this and I wasn't able to convert it. And are there no errors? No, that's false now. That's our flag. And so we need to stop processing because we have invalid input. Then outside of the loop, once we're all done, we can say, well, how many did we get? Well, if we got more than 0, because we don't want to divide by 0, then we can calculate the average and display it to one decimal place. Otherwise, we'll say, hey, there's no errors, there's no scores found. And then there we go. There we have it. So let's see this. All right, let's see this. How many scores do we want to enter? Let's just be simple and do 3. Let's do 99.9, 88.8, and 77.7 because that's easy to calculate that the average is indeed the same as the middle. And there we go. Yes, now let's do 3 more, but let's do it just a little bit differently. What if we said 70 here? Notice we handled it properly instead of throwing a traceback error to say, hey, I don't know how to parse 70, and so the average of what I had is 94.3. We can say, great, thank you. Now, let's contrast this example here. Let's take this code and let's modify it. Exception handling example. Okay. All right, so demonstrating exception handling. And I'm intentionally taking this code and modifying it to highlight the differences. Okay, so we're going to continue with the same outer structure, and we're also going to continue with not checking this one and hope the user is well behaved. But this big part here where we're getting the float and testing it, that's the part we're going to simplify here. And so instead of having a while loop that says, hey, have we found any problems? Let's just operate as if things are going to work, but and then if they don't, catch the exception. So we're going to try it, and if it works, great, and if not, then we'll catch the exception. So we could say, hey, the counter in range, and let's keep as much the same as possible. So to number of inputs plus 1. Okay, so we just simplified that loop here. Because we simplified that while loop, we can get rid of that counter increment there, because that'll cause problems otherwise. We still need to retrieve the specified number from the user, and so we're just going to get that here and get that score. But we don't need to verify it, we don't need to test it, and so we're not going to do all this testing to see if it's a float. We're just going to assume that it is working well and then proceed forward. So we don't need to do that. Wow, we just deleted a lot of code. Now what we need now is an accept, and the accept that, because this right here can raise a value error. Okay, so we need to accept for a value error, and then we can print and say error invalid score, and let's display it here, score string. Okay, because that's what we're anticipating, is that it's not going to be able to display that. Okay, and then everything else remains the same. Whoa, wow, notice how we condensed that whole section to say, hey, we're going to try this and assume it's going to work, and if it doesn't, we'll catch an exception and handle that. And so that really simplifies it. So let's do Python exception handling example, and let's say 3. Let's make sure it still works. Oh, okay, let's try it again. Whoa. And let's do the exact same example. Notice we get the exact same error message, exact same average, and things are working very nicely. And so now the error checking code worked just fine. The difference is it was harder to read, and so whereas the exception handling example focused more on the normal execution and handled the exceptions. So once we're familiar with handling exceptions, this example is much easier to follow. And just as a caveat, both of these examples are not complete. For example, we're not asking the user how many scores they want to enter. We're not testing when we're asking the user how many scores they want to enter. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out my other videos.